At 46, he had the kind of life that many people looked at with envy. He wore sharp suits, drove a polished car, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his way around courtrooms. For more than 20 years, he had been a defense lawyer, and not just any lawyer, one of the best in his city. Judges respected him, clients trusted him, and his opponents often walked into hearings already knowing that they might lose the case. On paper, everything looked perfect. He had money in the bank, an office in the tallest building downtown, and a reputation that kept new clients knocking at his door. His walls were filled with framed certificates, photographs with well-known figures, and awards that recognized his sharp mind and persuasive voice. But when the lights in his office went off at night and the heavy doors closed behind him, a different picture appeared, one that nobody else could see. He lived alone in a spacious apartment with glass windows that overlooked the busy streets below. From up there, he could watch thousands of people rushing home to their families, children pulling at their parents' hands, couples laughing over coffee, friends walking side by side. He often stood by the window with a glass of water in his hand, watching them, wondering what it would feel like to be part of something that simple. His days were long, filled with meetings, research, and court appearances. He was excellent at what he did, but the work left little room for anything else. Relationships had come and gone over the years, some too brief to even remember. The truth was, his job demanded too much, and he gave it willingly. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that love was not meant for him, that maybe his purpose was only to fight battles in the courtroom, not to share life with another soul. Still, deep inside, he carried a quiet longing. Sometimes, after winning a big case, he would step into his car, start the engine, and feel empty. The applause faded quickly, the news headlines disappeared in a day, and what remained was silence. Success filled his pockets, but not his heart. People around him thought he was the kind of man who had it all figured out. His colleagues admired his discipline, his clients admired his strength, and young lawyers wanted to be like him. But no one really knew the cost of the life he lived. No one knew how many nights he ate dinner alone at a corner table in a quiet restaurant. No one knew how many mornings he woke up to silence, his phone filled only with work emails. Not a single message asking how he was feeling. What made him different was not just his brilliance in law, but also his sense of fairness. He was not the kind of lawyer who only cared about winning. He cared about truth, about giving people a second chance. He had defended both the innocent and the guilty, but he believed that every story deserved to be heard. That belief made him both respected and feared. Clients came to him with their secrets, and he carried those secrets like heavy stones. Sometimes those secrets haunted him. He had seen the worst of human nature: betrayal, greed, cruelty, and he carried those images home with him. He rarely spoke about it, but late at night, when he sat with a file open in front of him, he could feel the weight of every broken life he had witnessed. And yet, despite all of this, he never let his guard down. He walked into courtrooms with steady steps, his voice calm, his words sharp. To the world, he was unshakable. Inside, however, there were cracks, tiny fractures in a wall he had spent years building. He wasn't lonely because he lacked company. He was lonely because nobody truly understood him. His friends were mostly other lawyers, people who spoke the same language of law, deadlines, and cases. They met at events, exchanged polite words, and sometimes shared a drink, but it was never personal. Everything stayed on the surface. There were moments when he thought about what might have been if he had chosen differently. What if he had slowed down earlier in life? What if he had chosen love over late nights in the office? What if he had allowed someone close enough to see his vulnerable side? These thoughts came quietly, often in the middle of the night when sleep refused to come. One Friday evening, as he walked out of court after another long day, he felt a sharp awareness of how repetitive his life had become. The same routine, the same victories, the same emptiness. He got into his car, started the engine, and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time, he noticed the faint lines on his face, the gray strands in his hair, the tiredness in his eyes. He wondered if it was too late to change anything. That thought stayed with him as he drove home. The city lights blurred past, and for once, he didn't turn on the radio. He let the silence fill the car. He let the questions rise, questions he had ignored for years. Was this all there was? Was this success? Or had he traded too much for a life that looked perfect but felt empty? He didn't know then that his life was about to shift. He didn't know that fate had a plan waiting, something he could never have written in his careful schedules or predicted in his courtroom strategies. All he knew was that something inside him was stirring, as if the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to loosen, brick by brick. He was a man everyone knew about, yet very few truly knew. His name appeared in business magazines, stock market reports, and glossy covers that praised him as a genius of modern finance. At 50, he was one of the most powerful investors in the country. Billionaire, risk-taker, visionary, those were the titles people gave him. But behind all the headlines, he was just a man who carried his own share of battles, though he would never let the world see them. From the outside, his life looked almost unreal. A mansion at the edge of the city with private gardens, expensive cars parked in long garages, and a private jet that could take him anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. He attended charity galas where people whispered his name like he was a legend. He moved through rooms filled with politicians, artists, and businessmen as though he owned them all. And in many ways, he did. Money had given him power, and power had given him control. Deals bent in his favor, doors opened before he even knocked, and people agreed with him before he finished his sentence. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. His empire already spoke louder than words ever could. But for someone who had so much, he never seemed satisfied. His days started early, often before the sun even touched the horizon. While the city slept, he was already scanning reports, making calls across time zones, and shifting numbers in ways that changed entire industries. One phone call from him could raise or break the value of a company. Investors held their breath when he entered the market. He thrived on that kind of influence, the ability to shape the future with a signature or a sentence. Yet, when the long meetings ended and the applause faded, a silence followed him home. The mansion was grand, but it was also empty. He had people around him all the time, assistants, advisors, guards, but they were not companions. They were employees. They served his needs, but never touched his soul. He had been married once, many years ago. It had ended quietly, without scandal, but the cracks of that relationship had left marks on him. Since then, he avoided attachments. He told himself love was a distraction, that emotions could cloud judgment. To him, life was a board game, and only the sharpest players survived. Affection didn't belong on the board, but deep down, there were moments when he questioned that belief. Late at night, when he sat alone on the balcony of his mansion, looking at the skyline, he felt something missing. Success filled his bank accounts, but not his heart. He often wondered why the quiet of his home felt heavier than the noise of the stock market. Despite this, he wore his armor well. In public, he was the man who never faltered, the man who always won. His laughter was confident, his words measured, his decisions swift. People admired him, some feared him, but no one dared to challenge him. In his world, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was dangerous. The lawyer, the man from Part 1, had been working with him for years. They shared a complicated bond. On one side, they respected each other, two men at the top of their fields. On the other, they circled each other carefully, like chess players protecting their next move. The lawyer provided the shield. The billionaire supplied the battlefield. Together, they made a powerful team, but neither truly trusted the other. Trust, after all, was a currency both men had stopped spending long ago. What made the billionaire unique was his hunger for more, not money, but control. He wanted to shape not only his own destiny, but the fate of everyone who came near him. If he invested in a company, he wanted a say in how it was run. If he donated to a foundation, he wanted influence in its decisions. If he brought someone into his circle, he wanted loyalty, no questions asked. And loyalty mattered more to him than love. To him, loyalty was proof of respect, proof of strength. That was why betrayal, even in small forms, cut him deeply. He would forgive mistakes, but never betrayal. Still, there was a softer side to him, though few ever saw it. He enjoyed art, often buying paintings not just for their value, but because they stirred something in him. He loved silence and nature, long walks by the sea, the sound of rain on his glass windows, the smell of fresh earth in his gardens. For those brief moments, he felt human again, not just a machine of wealth and power. But as soon as the phone rang, the softness disappeared, replaced by the sharp mind of an investor. It was at one of his high-profile gatherings, surrounded by glittering chandeliers and well-dressed guests, that the threads of his life began to shift. He didn't notice it right away, but that night would plant the seeds of a story far more complicated than any deal he had ever made. For now, he was still the untouchable billionaire, the man who had everything yet quietly lived with the question, what does it mean to have everything, if it still feels incomplete? He didn't know it yet, but the answer was on its way, an answer that would not come through numbers, contracts, or power plays. It would come in the most unexpected form, and it would challenge every rule he had lived by. The evening was warm, and the ballroom glowed under golden chandeliers. Music drifted through the air, a mix of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of conversations that only happened in places where wealth and power gathered. It was one of those nights where everyone looked perfect, men in tailored suits, women in glittering gowns, every smile carefully polished. The lawyer had been invited by the billionaire, not because he enjoyed these parties, but because it was part of his duty. He usually stood quietly near the edges of the room, speaking only when necessary, observing more than participating. Crowds were not his comfort zone. He preferred the silence of his office or the order of a courtroom. But that night, someone broke the rhythm of his routine. She entered the room like a painting brought to life. She wasn't covered in jewels or wearing the loudest dress. In fact, her gown was simple, flowing softly around her as though it didn't care about attention. But she had a presence, a kind of quiet confidence mixed with innocence, that drew the eye. At 24, she looked too young to belong in a gathering where people spoke of markets, contracts, and international deals. Yet, she didn't seem out of place. She held herself with ease, her eyes bright, scanning the room as though she was both curious and cautious at the same time. The lawyer noticed her without meaning to. He told himself he was only observing, like he always did. But when her eyes met his for a brief second across the crowded room, something stirred inside him. It was not the kind of feeling he was used to, calculated, logical, predictable. This was different, unexpected, almost dangerous. He quickly looked away, reminding himself that he was there on business, not for distractions. Later in the evening, fate or maybe chance brought them closer. He was standing by a corner table, sipping a glass of water, when she stepped near, placing her small clutch on the edge of the table. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she glanced at him and said with a smile, "You don't look like you're enjoying this party." Her voice was light, natural, without the forced charm he had grown used to in these circles. He gave a polite smile back and replied, "These events aren't really my style." "Mine either," she said, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. "But sometimes you just find yourself in places you didn't plan on being." He turned to her, curious now. She didn't sound like the other guests. There was no trace of ambition in her tone, no effort to impress. It was refreshing. "And what brought you here tonight?" he asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Let's just say, I know someone who insisted I come." He didn't ask who, but something in the back of his mind already guessed. The billionaire. That thought should have been enough to close the conversation. If she was connected to his most powerful client, then any interest in her was a road leading nowhere. But instead of walking away, he found himself wanting to know more. Their conversation continued simple things at first. She spoke about her studies, her love for art, the way colors could express feelings words often failed to capture. He listened, realizing it had been years since anyone had spoken to him with such honesty. Around her, there were no masks, no strategies, just a young woman with dreams that felt untouched by the heavy weight of power. As they talked, he noticed details, the way her eyes lit up when she described a painting she admired, the way she laughed without holding back, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was curious. These little things made her feel real in a room filled with people pretending. But underneath the warmth of that conversation, he felt a warning. She was too young, too close to a world that already belonged to someone else, too dangerous for a man like him, who had built his life on discipline and control. Every instinct told him to step back, and yet he didn't. When the music changed and the crowd shifted toward the dance floor, she excused herself with a gentle smile. "It was nice talking to you," she said softly, almost as if she meant it. He nodded, but as she walked away, he felt a strange pull, a sense that something had just begun, something he wasn't ready for. Later that night, as he prepared to leave, he caught a glimpse of her again. This time, she was speaking with the billionaire. They stood close, the older man's hand resting lightly on her arm as he introduced her to another guest. The lawyer froze for a moment, the pieces falling into place. She wasn't just a stranger who wandered into the gala, she was connected deeply to the very man who trusted him as an advisor and protector. The realization hit him hard. Whatever spark he had felt was forbidden, and the consequences of following it could be devastating. But the strange thing was, knowing all of that didn't erase the memory of her smile, her words, her voice. That night, as he drove home, he tried to push her out of his thoughts. He told himself it was a fleeting moment, nothing more. But deep inside, he knew the truth. He had crossed an invisible line, a line that separated caution from curiosity, reason from desire. And though he didn't want to admit it, part of him already knew this was not the last time their paths would cross. The days after the gala moved slowly, but the memory of that brief meeting refused to fade. The lawyer told himself it had been nothing, just a passing conversation, a young woman making small talk at a crowded party. But the truth clung to him. Her voice, her smile, the way she spoke with an openness he hadn't felt in years, it all stayed, lingering in the quiet spaces of his mind. He buried himself in work, as he always did. Courtrooms, legal papers, late nights in his office. Yet, in the middle of reading complex contracts or preparing arguments, he would suddenly find himself thinking about her words that night. Sometimes, you just find yourself in places you didn't plan on being. It was as though she had spoken not only about herself but about him too. It wasn't long before their paths crossed again. This time, it wasn't at a glittering ballroom, but in the quieter setting of an art gallery. He had been invited to a private showing, mostly for clients and wealthy collectors. He hadn't expected to see her there, but as he moved between canvases, studying colors and brushstrokes, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You don't strike me as the gallery type," she teased lightly. He turned, and there she was, wearing something simple yet elegant, her hair falling softly round her shoulders. The atmosphere was different now. Without the noise of a crowded party, without the shadow of chandeliers, she seemed even more real. He smiled, a little caught off guard. "And you don't strike me as the type to remember faces at crowded events," she laughed. "Some faces are hard to forget." The comment lingered in the air, more loaded than either of them expected. For a moment, they just stood there, the silence between them filled by the quiet hum of others admiring the paintings. Then she turned toward a canvas and began talking about the colors, the story behind the brushwork, her eyes lighting up with passion. He listened, not only to her words, but to the way she seemed to carry life inside her. From that evening, something unspoken began to grow between them. They didn't plan it, didn't announce it, but their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes it was at public events, sometimes in small corners of the city where they could talk without eyes watching. Every time, he told himself it was the last, that he needed to step back before it went too far. And yet, every time, he returned. With her, he felt something he hadn't in years. Youth, not in the sense of age, but in spirit. She reminded him of the person he once was before the endless grind of his career, before success hardened him into someone who measured life in victories and losses. With her, laughter came easier. Conversations weren't strategies. Time felt lighter, but underneath that sweetness was the heavy truth: this was dangerous. She was connected to the billionaire, the man who had trusted him for years. Even if nothing wrong had happened, the mere appearance of closeness could destroy reputations, careers, and more. He knew that better than anyone, and yet, knowing all this didn't stop him. He tried to explain it to himself. Maybe it was her honesty in a world full of masks. Maybe it was the way she looked at him as though he wasn't just a successful lawyer, but a man with stories with scars, with hidden pieces worth discovering. Maybe it was just fate to people colliding at the wrong time, in the wrong place, but in the right way. Still, there were moments of guilt. He would sit at his desk late at night, the city lights outside his window, and wonder if he was making a mistake. He would remind himself of the lines he had always sworn never to cross. But then he would remember her laugh, her questions, her way of making him feel alive again. And the guilt would blur into something else, something like surrender. She, too, felt the pull, though she tried to hide it. She would tell herself he was too old, too serious, too wrapped up in a world she barely understood. But when they spoke, none of that mattered. The age gap faded, the differences dissolved. She felt seen in a way she hadn't before, as though he understood her not by what she said, but by what she left unsaid. One evening, as they walked out of a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, she turned to him and said softly, "Do you ever feel like some things are meant to happen, even if the world says they shouldn't?" He looked at her, the weight of her words pressing against everything he had tried to resist. All the time, he admitted, that moment was a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. It wasn't a declaration, not yet, but it was enough to show that neither of them could ignore what was happening. Still, the shadow of the billionaire loomed over them. His presence was like a silent warning, a reminder that this attraction wasn't just risky, it was forbidden. And in the lawyer's world, forbidden things came with consequences. But sometimes, attraction is not a choice. It is a current, strong and relentless, pulling to people closer no matter how hard they try to swim against it. And in the quiet corners of the city, away from judging eyes, that current had already begun to carry them both. The closer they grew, the heavier the shadow became. It wasn't a shadow cast by buildings or trees, but by a man, one of the most powerful men in the city, the billionaire. His presence stretched into every room, every whispered conversation, every stolen moment. He didn't have to be there physically. His influence was enough to make both the lawyer and the young woman aware of the line they were crossing. The billionaire was not blind. He had lived too long in a world of deals and betrayals to miss the smallest shift in people's behavior. He noticed the way the lawyer's eyes lingered a second too long when she entered a room. He noticed the quiet tone in their conversations, the unspoken energy that sparked between them. And though nothing had been openly admitted, he didn't need words to see the truth for him. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about romance. To him, she was part of his world, a piece of his carefully built empire. Maybe not in the same way as his companies or his properties, but still something he considered within his circle of influence. And to the billionaire, control mattered more than affection. When he gave someone a place in his world, he expected them to remain there, unquestioned and unchallenged. So when he sensed the lawyer stepping too close, he felt the quiet sting of betrayal. The lawyer had been his shield for years, the man who protected his interests, managed his risks, and fought his battles in court. They had built a partnership based on trust, not the trust of friendship, but the trust of necessity. And now, that bond felt cracked. The lawyer knew it too. Every time he sat across from the billionaire in meetings, every time he signed documents or gave legal advice, there was a part of him that wondered, does he know? The billionaire's voice remained calm, his expression steady, but underneath, there was a sharpness in his eyes, as though he was quietly measuring every move. The young woman, meanwhile, felt trapped in a silent triangle. She had never belonged fully to the billionaire, not in the way people whispered. Her connection to him was complicated, part mentorship, part expectation, part something she couldn't define. But she knew how the world saw it, and she knew what it looked like when she stood too close to the lawyer. And yet, despite the risks, she kept returning to the lawyer. Their conversations grew longer, their silences deeper. With him, she felt free of the weight of expectations. With him, she could speak of dreams without judgment, laugh without caution, and be seen as more than just a name linked to someone else's power. But the shadow pressed harder with each passing day. The billionaire began to test the lawyer, pushing him in small ways, demanding more, questioning decisions, watching how he responded. It was a game of silent pressure, a way to remind the lawyer who truly held power. The lawyer answered every challenge with calm professionalism, but inside, he felt the strain. He had spent his whole career staying on the safe side of lines, and now he was dancing on the edge of one that could end everything. One evening, at a private dinner hosted by the billionaire, the tension surfaced in an unspoken battle. The young woman was there, seated beside other guests, her presence as radiant as ever. The lawyer arrived late, offering polite greetings, but the moment his eyes found hers, the room seemed to shrink. The billionaire watched it all from across the table, his expression unreadable, but his silence louder than any accusation. The dinner went on with laughter, wine, and conversation about markets and politics, but beneath the surface, a different dialogue was unfolding. Every word, every glance, was measured. The billionaire made subtle remarks, stories about loyalty and betrayal, about how people often forgot where their strength came from. None of it was directed openly, but both the lawyer and the young woman felt the weight of each sentence. When the evening ended, the lawyer walked out into the night air, his chest heavy. He knew the billionaire had seen enough to suspect, maybe even to know. And once suspicion entered the billionaire's mind, it was only a matter of time before it became confrontation or still. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the image of her sitting there, her smile forced under the weight of the evening. He realized then that whatever this was between them, it was no longer a simple attraction. It was becoming something deeper, something worth fighting for. And that thought both terrified and steadied him. The billionaire, meanwhile, sat alone after the guests had gone. He poured himself a glass of wine, the city lights reflecting in the glass. He wasn't angry in the way ordinary men became angry. His was a colder fury, a kind that waited and calculated. To him, the situation wasn't about emotions, it was about control, about boundaries being tested. And he had no intention of letting anyone, not even his trusted lawyer, forget who held the real power. The stage was set. The lawyer was caught between his duty and his desire. The young woman was torn between the life she was expected to live and the one her heart pulled her toward. And the billionaire, silent, watchful, was ready to remind them both that shadows do not exist without a source. What none of them knew yet was how far those shadows would stretch, and how much they would have to lose before light could break through. The storm had been building for weeks, and now the clouds were impossible to ignore. The lawyer could feel it in every conversation with the billionaire, in every glance that carried a weight heavier than words. The quiet suspicion had turned into something sharper, something he could no longer dismiss as paranoia. The billionaire knew, maybe not everything, but enough that the young woman sensed it too. She carried herself with a calm face, but behind her eyes there was unease. She had lived long enough around power to understand how fragile it could be, how quickly it could turn against those who stepped out of line. With every meeting, every gathering, she felt the invisible walls closing in tighter. For the lawyer, the breaking point came slowly, like cracks spreading across glass. At first, it was small, an extra question from the billionaire about his schedule, a subtle remark about loyalty in front of others, a pause too long when their eyes met. But then came the real test. One afternoon, in the billionaire's towering office with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the lawyer was handed a new task. On the surface, it was routine, a contract review for an upcoming deal. But buried inside the papers was something else, an unusual clause, something that didn't add up. It wasn't illegal, not quite, but it was close. It was risky, reckless, the kind of move that could destroy reputations if it went wrong. The lawyer read through the pages, his mind sharp as ever. When he looked up, the billionaire was watching him closely, almost daring him to question it. "Do you see any problems?" the billionaire asked, his voice smooth but edged. The lawyer held the papers a moment longer. "It's aggressive," he replied carefully. "If this comes to light, it won't be easy to defend." The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I didn't ask if it was easy. I asked if it was possible." The air between them thickened. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. It was a test of loyalty, a way of asking, "Are you with me, or are you against me?" That night, the lawyer sat in his apartment with the contract spread across his desk. He stared at the words, but his thoughts kept drifting elsewhere, to her, to the moments that felt real, that reminded him of a life outside these walls of power and pressure. And he knew, with painful clarity, that the more he held onto her, The further he was drifting from the billionaire's world, he was standing on a cliff. On one side was loyalty, career, reputation, the life he had built for decades. On the other was something fragile but powerful, love, or at least the possibility of it. A future that was uncertain, but alive. The young woman faced her own breaking point. She had grown tired of silence, of living in the shadows of men who saw her as an accessory, an extension of their influence. The lawyer had shown her something different, not possession, but recognition. He saw her not as someone linked to the billionaire, but as herself. That truth both comforted and terrified her, because the closer she moved toward him, the more she risked being caught in a storm far greater than either of them. Their secret meetings became harder to arrange. Eyes followed them, whispers grew louder. At one cafe, she noticed a familiar face, a man who worked for the billionaire sitting 2 tables away, pretending to read a newspaper. Another time, the lawyer found his phone ringing late at night. The billionaire's voice calm but pointed. "I trust you're keeping busy." Every word was layered. Every silence was dangerous. Finally, the breaking point arrived, not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in a quiet evening when the lawyer and the young woman met in a park at dusk. The city lights flickered in the distance, the air heavy with unspoken fear. "I can't keep living like this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Every time I see him, I wonder if he already knows. Every time I walk into a room, I feel eyes on me. I don't want to be a secret anymore." He looked at her, his chest tight. "If we do this, if we step out of the shadows, we'll lose everything. My career, his trust, maybe more." She took a step closer, her eyes searching his. "Then answer me honestly. Is it worth it?" The question cut through him like a blade. He thought of the years he had given to his profession, the sacrifices, the nights spent chasing victories instead of happiness. He thought of the billionaire, the man who could crush him with a word. And then he thought of her, the way she laughed, the way she spoke of dreams, the way she made him feel human again. His answer came quietly, but with a certainty that surprised even him. "Yes, it's worth it." The words hung in the air, both terrifying and liberating. It was the choice he had avoided for weeks, the choice he knew would change everything. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky. The storm had arrived, and there was no turning back. The breaking point wasn't just about love, it was about truth. And the truth was clear now. They could no longer hide. The path ahead would be brutal, filled with consequences neither could predict. But for the first time, both of them felt free, not because the danger had vanished, but because they had chosen to face it together. And in the billionaire's world, that choice was the greatest act of defiance they could make. The storm had broken. The choice had been made. There was no going back to silence, no retreat into shadows. The lawyer and the young woman had crossed the line together, and now the world around them began to shift. At first, it was subtle, longer pauses in conversations with colleagues, the sudden coolness in meetings with clients, the whispers that seemed to rise when either of them entered a room. People could sense when something wasn't as it appeared. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, had a way of leaving trails. The billionaire, of course, was no fool. He had built his empire by reading people, by noticing the details others overlooked. He didn't need a confession. He didn't need proof. The look in their eyes told him enough. And for a man like him, betrayal was not measured only in actions, but in intentions. The confrontation came quietly, not with shouting or threats, but with a calmness that was almost more dangerous. The lawyer was called into the billionaire's office one evening. The city outside, the glass windows glowed with lights, but inside the room, it was heavy with silence. "I've trusted you for years," the billionaire said, his voice steady, his eyes sharp. "You've stood beside me through battles that would have destroyed other men. But now, I see you've forgotten where loyalty begins and ends." The lawyer didn't argue. He didn't offer excuses. He knew there was no defense that would change the billionaire's mind. Instead, he simply said, "Some things go beyond loyalty." The words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of his choice. The billionaire leaned back, studying him, as though deciding whether to respect his courage or crush him for it. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Then you've chosen your path. Just remember, paths have prices." From that day, the lawyer's world changed. Doors that had always been open began to close. Clients who once trusted him shifted their business elsewhere. Invitations to events stopped arriving. The safety net of his reputation, built over decades, began to fray. The young woman felt the impact too. The billionaire, while not cruel, withdrew his support. She was no longer welcome in the circles he controlled. The easy invitations, the comfortable protection, all of it vanished. She was left with a new reality, one that was smaller, lonelier, but also more honest. Together, they faced the fallout. It was not easy. There were nights when the weight of what they had lost pressed so heavily on them. That silence filled the room. Nights when doubt crept in, asking if love was enough to stand against power, against a world that seemed determined to punish them. But then there were other moments of clarity and joy that reminded them why they had chosen this path. A walk through the park without fear of being watched. A simple dinner at a small restaurant where no one cared about names or reputations. Quiet mornings when they sat side by side, sipping coffee, not needing to say anything because being together was enough. For him, the lawyer, it was a chance to live a life he had long denied himself, no longer defined only by victories in court or the weight of responsibility. He discovered the simple happiness of sharing his world with someone who cared not about his reputation, but about him. For her, the young woman, it was freedom, the chance to step out from under the shadow of powerful men and into a life she could choose for herself. She was no longer someone's secret, someone's possession, or someone's name whispered at parties. She was her own, and she had chosen him. And yet, the question lingered, whispered by the world around them, spoken in headlines and hushed conversations. What if it isn't love? What if it's just rebellion? Just a fleeting fire that will burn out once the weight of reality becomes too heavy? But the two of them knew the answer wasn't for the world to decide. Love, after all, is not measured by approval or permission. It's measured in the moments people are willing to risk everything for. One evening, months after the storm had first broken, they stood together on the balcony of his apartment. The city stretched out before them, alive with lights and movement. She leaned against the railing, her hair brushing softly against his arm. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, the city reflected in her eyes. Regret. He shook his head slowly. No. Fear, yes. Doubt, sometimes. But never regret. She smiled, a small, genuine smile, the kind that held both relief and gratitude. Me neither. For a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the world below. And in that silence was an answer not to the world's questions, not to the billionaire's judgment, but to their own hearts. They had lost much, but what they gained was something neither had ever truly known before. A love that defied expectation, a love that demanded courage, a love that asked them to stand against the odds and still hold on. So what if it was forbidden? So what if it was costly? So what if the world disapproved? What if, after all, it was true love?